Hi everybody, how you doing? Yeah? Sorta? Okay, great. Hi, my name's Josephine. Thanks so much for having me and for coming here. There's a lot of options, a lot of great options at this conference, so I'm very glad you made it here to talk about web accessibility. Who has worked with web accessibility before? Show of hands. Oh, quite a lot of you. Okay, great. And is there anybody who, for whom this is a very new topic? A few. Okay, I hope, regardless of whether you're already an expert or are you just starting on your accessibility journey, I hope there's still something in there for you. Um, and we're going to dive right in. So, my name is Josephine. I already mentioned that. I flew in yesterday from Germany, and I was surprised at how tall everything is here. so I'm really relieved this desk is so short because I had the instance where I couldn't even. Well, let's not get into that. Yeah, my name is Josephine. I am a developer relations engineer at Storyblok. Storyblok is a headless CMS. And apart from that, I'm a Google developer expert, Girl Code ambassador, and I am an accessibility advocate. And that's also why I'm here. I really like talking about web accessibility. So what are we going to do today? We're going to have a quick look at what web accessibility is, why it's important, and then we're going to dive into what you can do. We're going to have a look at some practical tools. And then, of course, also how to keep going if you got started testing for accessibility. And there's going to be some tools that I'll mention. I have a QR code in the end, and I'm going to share the slides afterwards, so don't worry if there's anything that's interesting to you. It's going to be there. Just wait. So, what is web accessibility? So just like in the physical world, we need accessibility to accommodate people with different needs or disabilities, right? So if you think about the advances in technology, there has been a lot of improvement already. Like if you think a paper newspaper, for example, how are you going to convert that to Braille or to spoken word? So there is some improvement, but what we as developers, as designers have to do is make sure there's actually web accessibility in place so that people can use these advances, right? And web accessibility basically means that the tools, the technologies, everything is implemented and designed in a way so that people with disabilities can use it and participate equally on the web. And there's a little bit of terminology that we're just going to get out of the way before we dive into the practical bits. And one of the things, if you're new to this topic, you might stumble across is A11Y, that stands for accessibility. It's a numeronym, just like I18N or L10N. So it's just shorter for accessibility. And then there is the WCAG, so that's a mouthful. That's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a shared set of rules, kind of an internationally agreed standard that have different levels of accessibility. So we have A, AA, and AAA, and you want to probably comply to one of those, the most common being the AA standard. All of this was created by the WAI, so the Web Accessibility Initiative, a lot of long words, and they kind of decided upon this, and they're constantly evolving and making it better, right? So currently they're on draft 2.2, I think, and then they're already working on 3.0, and they're continuously adapting to new technologies. And I was curious how the situation is in Norway, actually, and I found that enterprise solutions here have to comply at least with AA standard, and there are a few exceptions. I think they're related to live captioning and audio descriptions and stuff. But Norway is one of the countries in Europe that is actually on the stricter side, having implemented all these rules already. So that's really good. If you're from Norway, good for you. We're still working on it in Germany. It's not so strict, unfortunately. So yeah, that's kind of the foundation, if you will. And most of the rules within the WCAG, they come back to these 4 guiding principles. They're shortened to an acronym. They love abbreviations in accessibility, so it's POUR, standing for the different pillars, if you will, and we want to make sure that our content on our website or in our app is perceivable, right? So information must be presented in a way that people can actually will see it or hear it. And there has to be alternative text for images, or you have to be able to zoom in, for example. All of that is part of making the content perceivable. Then we want to make sure it's operable. So people should actually be able to navigate around your service or your product. That can include things like keyboard accessibility, for example, because not everybody is using a mouse or a trackpad, right? And we're going to go into that later because that's one of the things that goes wrong the most as well. Then we want to make sure that our content is understandable. So people have to understand how to use your navigation, for example. If there's a requirement for user input, you want to make sure that there's labels, for example, to inform people on what is actually expected of them. And you want to make sure that it's robust. That's the last of the 4 principles. So it should be able to be interpreted by different user agents, also assistive technology, for example. And Semantic HTML, for example, helps a lot with that. Writing semantic code makes your application a lot more robust, and we're also going to dive into that a little bit later. All right, so we got the terminology out of the way. Since a lot of you raised their hands already, I'm assuming you care already at least a little bit, or you have to care by your employer. But assuming that maybe sometimes you have to convince somebody to give you money for a project or for additional testing efforts, we're going to talk a little bit about why you or somebody else should care and how you can convince them. So accessibility is a human right as defined by the United Nations. Access to communication technologies, including the web, is defined as a basic human right, right? So that should finish the whole conversation. Unfortunately, it doesn't usually. But this is definitely a massive point on why we should care. Then, if you're a developer and you care about creating good code, readable code, maintainable code, you likely care about making it semantic, and that making good code is already going to improve accessibility, not by like everything, but by a lot. So this is also, if you care about being good at your job, you want to care about web accessibility. Then there are new laws coming into place. So for Norway, a lot of this is already covered in your legislation, but there's new laws coming to the EU for accessibility guidelines. How they're interpreted is very different from country to country. So, and I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to talk about it too much, but this is definitely something to look out for and see how your country or the markets that you want to work in interpret these laws. And then if you are coming from the more economic side of things, you want to sell something, you're going to open up your product or your service to a much larger audience if you comply with web accessibility, right? So this is definitely something to look out for. A lot of people are affected by disabilities or experience some form of disabilities in their lifetime, right? So do you have a rough number of the percentage of people that are experiencing disability? Can you shout something out at me? 50? Okay, somebody else? 20? Okay, one last guess. 80. Okay. Yeah, there's lots of different interpretations of this, of course, and the experience of disability is super hard to measure, right? And global data as well is really, really difficult to collect. And there was a report by the World Health Organization that found that 15% of the global population experience some form of disability throughout their lifetime, and that's 1 billion people. That's a lot of people, right? So even if you're coming from a business side and you care about numbers and you care about spending power, this is something to look out for sure, because that's a lot of people who want to pay for your service. So that's always a good point to make. And lastly, web accessibility benefits all of us, as we're going to see in a little bit, right? So I feel like this should not be a point in this whole argument, because we should be doing this also if it were just to affect a minority. But sometimes that's what helps convince people pay for accessibility testing, so it does benefit all of us, right? So we're going to have a look at some of the potential users who might benefit from web accessibility. So there's people with different kinds of disabilities or impairments. So you have physical, auditory, cognitive, neurological, speech, or visual disabilities. But you also have what they call here temporary or situational limitations, right? So imagine you are in an environment where you don't want to turn up the volume, so you will benefit from captions. Or maybe you have super slow internet connection. The images don't load, but you still want to get some context, and you'll benefit from an alternative text, right? There's so many different use cases. Maybe you're holding a baby or a cat, and you just can't just use one arm. So all of these are cases in which web accessibility is very beneficial. All right, and all of us are getting older, so at some point it's going to catch all of us, right? All right, so I hopefully have convinced you that this is important. So we're going to have a look at some practical things now. And we're going to look at the things that kind of come up in audits the most, from my experience, which is color contrast, keyboard accessibility, and semantic HTML. There's a lot more to web accessibility, but this is something, it's a good starting point. And there's lots of different facets to it as well, if you will. So the first thing we're going to have a look at is color contrast. And this is literally the #1 thing that comes up the most. Of course, it's also very repetitive. If your brand colors are not accessible, it's going to pop up in an audit like 90 times because, well, everything is in that color combination then. But color contrast basically means that the contrast between the background and the foreground is high enough for as many people to see as possible, right? So for example, here the background is light blue and the foreground, the writing in this case, is somewhat black. So this is quite high color contrast and we can see it quite all right, I hope. And so sticking to this minimum, which I'm going to show you in a little bit, is going to help for people with visual impairments, but also like if you're looking at your phone in bright sunlight, like today, which we don't see a lot of, but if you go outside, you want to check something, it might not be super visible. So, and you can't trust color, as we're going to see in a second, because maybe if you have color blindness, maybe this is what this slide looks like for you, right? Or people with some people might have difficulty distinguishing between different colors. Color blindness itself is relatively rare, but it's a spectrum, right? So this is definitely something to think about, that some people might experience your content in shades of gray, literally. Or a lot more common, red-green color blindness. That affects 1 in 12 men, I think, roughly. So this is a lot more common, right? And maybe they have a completely different experience of your design than other people. So we can't trust color. I was mentioning that the color contrast needs to be high enough. And in this case, I mean compliant with AA standards. So it has to be 4.5 to 1. And so here you see an example where the light blue background with a white writing has a terrible color contrast. It's already super hard to read, let alone outside. And then, of course, black writing on a white background is a lot easier to read, right? So if we go back to the poor principles, that would be, it needs to be perceivable. And then there's some exceptions to the rules. So if you have larger text, the contrast requirements are a little bit lower. Same as if you have bold text, for example. And then if you have a wider stroke, for example, it's easier to read, but that doesn't change the requirements, right? It's just general practice, if you will. So let's try it. Let me try and, okay, I moved over to the different screen. Bear with me, and we're gonna use something called the Web Disability Simulator. And here again, we can go for different options. So we can have a look at. Oh, actually, I have a demo site I wanted to prove this on. Let's do it here. There we go. So now we can see, we can still see everything, but it looks a little bit different, right? Or I can, for example, choose again the red-green color blindness. Again, a little bit different, but not like dramatic. And then if I were to choose sunshine, you see here, we need a lot more color contrast because it's actually relatively hard to read what's going on. At least for some of the links, for example, it's almost impossible. And so this is something it's not super accurate, but it gives you a general idea of what different experiences might be like and can trigger further testing. So it's a good starting point for sure. And then if you want to dive in a little bit deeper, there are things like this color contrast checker, for example, where I can pick background color, and I can pick my foreground color. And I picked the wrong one, apparently. What did I do? This is fun. Let's try again. Let's imagine it picked the right one. Okay. Let's try again. Yes. Here we go. Okay, great. So now we can see that we have a score of 6.2, so that's good enough. It could be better, but it's good enough, right? And we see here at the bottom, I hope this is big enough for you to see, but it says we're passing for large font and AAA large font, and then for AA. And we're failing AAA normal, but that wasn't the goal, so that's quite all right. Right? So you could use one of these tools to test whether if you have already a page and you have already your brand colors, this might be something to look into and see if there could be any improvements on that. All right, let's actually return to the slides. Yeah, we're back. We don't need this anymore. Oh no. Maybe we have to continue. Okay, it's a glitch in the matrix, but we're going back. Oh, it's going to be interesting. Okay. All right. So we have seen that we can't really trust color, right? It looks a little bit different for everybody. It might be a spectrum. We have here, there's another glitch there. So we have different kinds of visual impairments where web accessibility will come in handy because these experiences might be different for different people. So what can you do? Very importantly, think about if you can, I know this is not the case for everybody, but if you can, implement accessible colors from the start, right? Implement this before you actually ship it. But if you can't, there's other things to think about, which we're going to go through in a second. There's tools that can help you generate an accessible color palette. You can either start from a color that you definitely want to use, or just let it give you something randomly. And then if you have a color palette, you can also check what kind of colors can you actually combine without messing it up. So you could maybe even stick to your existing colors, but just make sure everybody on the team knows which kind of colors can be combined so that it's readable and you're meeting the requirements, right? So that's also a good idea. And then you don't want to use color as your only indicator of change. So imagine somebody with red-green color blindness. What would they be able to see here? How would they know whether the API was operational or not? We added these little icons here, and then it's a lot easier to distinguish what's going on. So here again, they added some icons to show not only there's a red outline that says, okay, here's an issue, but actually we have the little warning sign, right? And then also here, imagine somebody with any sort of visual impairment, any inability to see or distinguish certain colors, would look at these colors and trying to pick a t-shirt for themselves. It's really hard to tell, right? Because we can't really trust it. So maybe adding labels to the colors is a good idea in terms of providing additional context, because this might be what it looks like for them. And then, of course, you could even make color names your like a USP. Like this sells very well to me. I'm not sure about you, but fancy names always get me. No, but you could definitely also, in their defense, they have the description in there in German that says that it's like a really bright blue, so they're okay. All right, so if you have existing brand colors that you really can't change, you might want to think about adding either a high contrast mode, for example, or you could also have a light mode and dark mode, right? So not for everybody, like these super bright colors work. Maybe somebody gets like really, I don't know, a headache, or it hurts their eyes if it's like super, super bright. So if there is a different version, they could easily change that. And of course, GitHub here has extensive options, and that's not at all a requirement, but it's definitely a good idea to think about maybe having just one option that people can turn on. Another idea would be to use the prefers color scheme attribute. So there's the side. And now I wanted to show you what happened here. Oh, it opens on my different screen, but you'll see anyway. If I switch to dark mode, not only the browser goes dark, but also it increases the contrast, right? So this is something that you could kind of, for user experience, adjust to whatever they prefer, and then just go back to light mode. So that's a really easy option to do, for example, in Tailwind, like we did in our example. If you're then thinking about color contrast even further, you want to make sure that all the hover and focus states also make sense with the color contrast, right? Because, for example, looking at here in the example, ooh, that was not supposed to happen. You see here, so if I hover, there's not enough color contrast, even though it was fine before, right? Or here, that's just not great. And also, we're indicating a change that we're hovering on a link only by color, and that's not, as we just learned, a great idea. Same here. It's really hard to distinguish that there was any change in the first place. And so that's definitely something to think about, and something that gets forgotten quite a lot. And also, the highest possible color contrast is not always the best option, right? So if you think about people who are neurodivergent, so maybe somebody with dyslexia, ADHD, autism on the autism spectrum, this is something where like super bright, flashy colors have kind of shown to be rather overstimulating. So maybe you want to go with something like a little off-white or a little more muted, while still sticking to the color contrast minimum, right? So those are just things to think about. And I know it's hard to change brand colors when they're already in place, but maybe think about providing different options. All right. So that was the first of our 3 main topics. And the next thing I want to talk about is keyboard accessibility. We already briefly mentioned it, right? So we want things to be operable. This is our poor principle again. And if think about keyboard accessibility, so I want to be able to use not only the mouse, but also assistive technology, maybe different kinds of keyboards. And I want to be able to tab through my page. And I'm using either the tab key or my arrow keys. And then there's a bunch of functionality if you're using a screen reader, for example, to navigate your page. You want to make sure that all the interactive elements are reachable via keyboard, and you want to stick to a tab order that's actually logical, right? So in English, that would be going from left to right and from top to bottom, just like you would want people to read. So it should stick to the natural flow of a page. And again, we want our focus to be visible and always visible, not remove it by setting like an outline none or something. And make sure that it has enough color contrast, else what's the use, right? So we can also try that on our page. It's not doing what I wanted to do. There we go. So first I could, of course, try to tab through my page. Might be really small, but you see like a little square popping up, or you don't. Wait, let me. It's got a bit bigger. This says skip to main content. So that's a skip link. And it helps users, if I press enter now, it's going to jump directly to the main content, enabling me to skip through the navigation. So if we imagine I had like a really massive navigation there, we would want the user to kind of not waste their time, be respectful of their time, and we maybe want to let them like just skip that if they know where they're going, right? So we tab through, we have a focus style, we can tab through the links. Here's also the button, and we're tabbing through. We just skipped a link actually, and we're tabbing. Okay, so this looks fine testing manually, but it also skipped a link, right? So if we wanted to maybe visualize this a little bit, I have this tool called Tab Ally. I think it's also working really well in the Firefox Dev Tools, actually. But it visualizes where the tab order goes and what order, what elements are reached, right? And so we see this is what we wanted. We wanted to go from left to right and from top to bottom. So far, so good. But then again, here we're skipping a link. I'm assuming that's because, so this is on purpose. But this is maybe because the link is empty, for example, right? And then we're going through the different elements here, right? So this is how you could visualize the tab order and kind of see if you're really hitting everything that you wanted to hit. Also a good idea. Okay, let me clear that and we'll return. So we've already had a chat about a couple of things you can do. This was the skip link that I mentioned. So it is basically invisible unless you tap to it, then it gets the focus and becomes visible. And this way it's not bothering people who maybe just use their mouse. They're never going to know. But for people who are using the screen reader, this will be really beneficial and save them a bunch of time. Right. Another thing to consider are landmark structures. So this kind of goes hand in hand with semantic HTML, but you want to make sure that you convey structure and meaning by the elements that you're using, right? So you just want to have one main, you want to use hierarchical headline structures, and you want to be sure that everything kind of has a place and is not only styled in a way that you want it to, but rather actually means something. It provides context, for example, to a screen reader. And that's important because we actually want to make sure, so there's, on Mac it's called VoiceOver Rotor. If you activate the VoiceOver, so that's like the screen reader that's already pre-installed on a MacBook if you're using that. And it has this functionality that lets you kind of go through a little bit like a skip link, but for different options. And you can go through and you see all the headings, all the links, everything that you want to, and you can kind of navigate a bit faster, and it's saving them a lot of time. It makes it a lot easier to kind of scan the page as you maybe would do visually. So this is something that's also a really good idea to test for. And then the last thing I want to talk about is semantic HTML. So we already touched upon it. That's because it's kind of the foundation of everything, right? So it means things like providing alternative text, having labels for links and for buttons. And like I mentioned before, really be sure that you're saying something and not covering it all up with a bunch of divs and styling them. I know you can all do that, but it would be so much better to have actually the meaning that you want to convey. Also, good usability, use the suitable input type, right? Be sure that it switches to the number pad if you set the input to number, for example. And stick to headline hierarchies. As we've just seen in the VoiceOver Rotor, this is going to help provide an outline for people who are, for example, using a screen reader. And there's this beautiful website by Manuel Matuzovic, who collected a bunch of examples from the real life about how not to do it. It's really good fun. Go check it out. This is how not to do it. And we can also have a look at our page. And so one thing that we could, for example, do, if we open up the XDev Tools. So XDev Tools are a suite of tests that you can also integrate in form of linter or GitHub Actions. But what this does, it scans your page, and this is a super small project, so that's not really really representative, but it kind of guides you through everything, not only the semantic HTML issues, but actually everything. And here we see, for example, we're missing a title element to aid with navigation, and we're missing alternative text somewhere, right? And so I just really quickly wanted to there we go. I just really quickly wanted to show that also on a real life page. So this is the company I work for, and Our site is not accessible at all, and we're working on it. And so if I run it here, you'll see that a lot more issues come up, and if you browse through it a little bit, you'll see here we need discernible text for buttons. There's a color contrast issue, and this tool kind of guides you through everything that's going on your page. Of course, these automated tools, they don't catch all the issues, but it's a good starting point. And you can kind of go from there and maybe see what is the most urgent and what can I relatively easily fix. Same also for Lighthouse, for example, just like for performance, you could test, of course, also for accessibility, right? So that's definitely a good idea. And if you want to go a little bit more specifically into HTML, you could run an HTML validator to guide you through the HTML, the structure. I think this is also very small, isn't it? Oh, there we go. So to check for your errors in HTML and CSS, as we can see here, right? So there's a lot going on. As I said, it's under construction, so bear with us. But this is also a good starting point for you to kind of go back and see, okay, so where can I do better, maybe, right? So this is another idea. And so if you're looking on what to do to kind of improve your HTML, you want to be sure that the whole team is on board, right? Like maybe you can make alternative text a requirement. If you're, for example, working with a CMS and you want to enforce that, maybe you can actually make sure that you can't add an image without alternative text for the editors, for example. Go back to your code, check the divs. Maybe there's one or two that you can convert into something more meaningful. Validate your HTML like we've just seen, and stick to meaningful headline hierarchies, because this is what we need for people with screen readers. It's going to help so much for them to comprehend your content and not just leave the page in frustration. So this was already a lot, but there's always more. So I mentioned voiceover, but of course there's different kind of screen readers that you could test for. So we got Narrator, JAWS, NVIDIA, Orca is the Linux one. So those are options to look into. Then you could, of course, test on mobile. That would be TalkBack and VoiceOver iOS, I think. This is also another thing to look out for. You could consider your fonts and maybe check if those are accessible and for what user groups. So again, there might be differences for if you're optimizing for more of a neurodivergent group, or how is the spacing. Are you using different kinds of fonts? So this is definitely something to look into. And then the list goes on, right? So you could add audio and video, transcripts. You could have sign interpretation. There's really lots of different options. And language accessibility is also a massive topic, right? Is your content translated into different languages? Is it translatable? Have you set the language for your entire page, or is it going to be read out in default English maybe, or in the default settings, and just going to sound horrible and like incomprehensible? So this is also definitely something to look into. And then there's also simple language, right? So like something like, I think it's called Simple English, so that you can actually make difficult abstract constructs maybe a little bit more understandable. And so I got you convinced. You got some topics that you maybe want to look into. How do you actually get started? So, of course, in an ideal world, it would be so amazing if we could all just start from scratch and then build in accessibility, right? That would be great. Usually, that's not the case. Let's be real. My first ever job as a developer was for a big German car company. They wanted to go to Canada with their brand and sell there, and they realized, oopsie, we actually have to pay a lot of fines because we're not compliant. So what do? We need to be compliant like yesterday. And of course, it's like massive legacy code base. It was hell. So this is real life, right? And then you have to find workarounds, and that's also, it's possible. It's not ideal, but it's possible. And if you're starting from a legacy project, you might want to do something like an audit first, depending on your budget. That might even be with a free tool like the XDev tool or Lighthouse or Firefox, whatever's your jam. And you audit that and see what is roughly going on. Maybe you're not even doing as bad as you think you are. And also think about, okay, so if you have very limited time and resources, what is the most common user journey on your page? Who are your customers? What are kind of low-hanging fruits? Maybe check your analytics and see, okay, these are my 5 most visited pages, so I'm just going to start there because that's going to have the biggest impact, right? And in the struggle that we're kind of like rebuilding our site now is also like there's no budget for this, of course, there's never is. So what do? We have to check where are we actually selling things to convince people to spend their time on it. And that's usually a good idea to then kind of identify where can I get people involved. If I refactor something, maybe I can make it a requirement to then make it accessible, for example. And if you want to then keep going, because unfortunately this is not a one-time thing, you're gonna build new components, you're gonna right? So you need to make sure that automation is in place to actually keep this alive. There are a bunch of linters that you could use depending on the framework or the programming language that you work in for your IDE. There are GitHub actions also, for example, by X. They have some things that you can put into place to run checks when you're trying to merge something, and it's gonna make your life a lot easier. Education is a massive part, so this is also a cultural change, and that's why it's so hard, right? So be sure everybody knows why it's important that you're doing this, to get them on board and to have like a collaborative effort, if you will, and remove barriers, right? So if the easier you make it to make it accessible, the more likely people will do it, because all of us are a little bit lazy, right? And of course, if you can, hire specialists, hire disabled people to test, because they're the natives in these systems. And as much as you can kind of read into it, they're going to know what are they expecting from a screen reader, for example? What is the expected behavior? So if you can, absolutely hire folks from that community. All right, that was a lot. Thank you, everybody, for being so patient. We have still some time for questions, if you have any. And also, here is the links that I promised. So under this QR code, you should be able to find all the tools that I use, some additional resources. If you have any questions and are don't want to ask them now, you can also always ping me on Twitter. I'm super happy to connect, to learn about your accessibility experience. And yeah, thank you so much.